message?
Of course.
I thought you were going to take vacation.
No, I took last Wednesday off.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Vacation, now it's done.
Sí.
Okay.
La próxima semana.
Sí,
All right. Just lining everything up on the screen. Grabbing a sip of tea. And I think it's about ready to get going. So, good evening or afternoon to everyone, depending upon where you are. It is time for us to continue our investigation of Yevamot. Now, we're actually going to continue the theme that we had 2 weeks ago, since I was not here last week, about some of the odd ways that second-generation children can still have an effect on the grandparents. So we're going to be looking at that as we continue here in chapter 7 and Mishnah number 6. So let's see how a high priest can actually keep his grandmother from eating truma. Remember, truma is the special food that only the priests and the priests' families can eat. So let's get that English centered for me to make it easier to read. Even with regard to a high priest, sometimes he disqualifies his grandmother from partaking of truma. How could it possibly be that the grandmother of a high priest would not be allowed to eat truma? Well, here's how it works. Ketzad, how it's so. If the daughter of a priest was married to an Israelite and she bore him a daughter, and the daughter went and married a priest and bore him a son, right? So we have the grandmother who was born to the Kohanim. She gets married to a regular Israelite. They have a daughter, and that daughter marries back into the Kohanim, marries back into the priestly clan. And then they have a son. Of course, that son will be a Kohen because that son is from a father who was a Kohen. Everybody with me? Okay. That son is fit to be a high priest, meaning there's nothing wrong with his status. His lineage is clear. He could absolutely be a high priest, and he stands and serves on the altar. This son enables his mother to partake of truma. So even though his mother was not born from a Kohen, because her son is a Kohen, even if her husband died, the mother would be allowed to still eat from the truma on behalf of her son. However, he disqualifies his mother's mother, his grandmother, from partaking of truma, as he is her offspring from her Israelite husband. So normally, if the grandmother had no surviving children from her Israelite husband, the grandmother would be allowed to go back to her original parents' home and be able to eat truma from that household. That would be fine. But since she has a surviving son from her non-Kohanic husband, the Israelite husband, even though that son is now a Kohen because of who her daughter married, she is still linked to him through the lineage of the non-Kohen from the Israelite husband. Therefore, she, even if she is a widow, is not able to return to her original family's home and eat truma from with them. Instead, her son can, her daughter can, and she cannot. And thus, this grandmother can say in disapproval, "Let there not be like my son's daughter, the high priest, as he disqualifies me from partaking of truma." I think this is the only time I've ever heard of a grandmother criticize her grandson. Normally, most grandparents would be overjoyed if their grandson became the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. But here, because of the very unusual family circumstances and because of the way that the surviving children link the mother to the husband that she had the child with, her status remains linked to the Israelite, even though her grandson is definitely a Kohen. Everyone follow this little conundrum, paradox? Okay, it's just a reminder, and I think it's almost a bit of a sense of humor by the rabbis of trying to just drive home the idea that the lineage of the children, as far as the mother goes, depends upon the husband that she had, not about the status they eventually attain. And that concept is going to be important come later on, probably tonight, I'd imagine, in our reading. Okay, so let's move on then to chapter 8. And chapter 8 is going to bring us some interesting concepts, a little bit which will be relevant to our holiday of Pesach, and others that are, of course, important in the broader scope of Jewish identity and identity under Jewish law. Chapter 8, Mishnah 1. An uncircumcised priest, that is to say, one for whom circumcision was considered too dangerous, so he didn't have a choice in the matter. This is usually the result of having had two older brothers who, once they were circumcised as children, passed away, clearly showing that there is a danger inside that family line to death from blood loss, probably hemophilia. Then you do not circumcise the next child. But even though there is a very good reason why he is not circumcised, still we are going to see that he falls under a special rule. So the uncircumcised priest and all who are ritually impure with any type of impurity may not partake of truma, the portion of produce which must be set aside for the priests. So even though they are Kohanim, and even though their status as being a Kohen is clear, they are not allowed to eat from the truma. Now, the ritual purity is quite obvious because the ritual purity disqualifies you from eating anything that is considered sacred or holy in any way. So it is not surprising. The forced non-circumcision, however, might seem a little unusual. So I made sure to get a note for that so that I could remember the precise analysis, because I know that we have many students that like a little bit more of the backstory than the Mishnah often provides. So the issue here is specifically with regard to the comparison of the language between the rules regarding truma and the rules regarding the Passover sacrifice. So with regards to the Passover sacrifice, it says that the sojourner, the toshav, the one that dwells among you, and a hired servant shall not eat the offering. And with regard to truma, it also points out that the sojourner, right, the tenant, the toshav, and the hired servant will also not eat of the holy thing. Now, with regards to Passover, the Midrash goes on to tell us, which we are also telling us that it is contingent upon the lack of circumcision, then so too, with regards to the truma, circumcision would be equally relevant. And so an uncircumcised priest, although his lineage is intact, he is not allowed to eat from the truma. Just a little bit of a glimpse into the backstory. However, and this is the part that might seem surprising, their wives, meaning the wives who are married to somebody that is either uncircumcised or ritually impure, and their slaves may partake of truma. That is perfectly fine because the status of their Kohanic lineage, the status of their position within the community is unchanged, even though they are not allowed to take of the truma themselves. So therefore, their wives and their slaves, they are allowed to go ahead and eat the truma as normal. To contrast that, however, with regards to both a man with crushed testicles or with other wounds to his genitals, what we call the petzua daka, and one whose penis has been severed. I know, not exactly a happy topic, one that we'd all rather not have to consider, but the Torah does talk about these cases in the Torah, so we must discuss it. If they are priests, and they and their slaves may partake of truma, as this condition does not disqualify them or their property. However, their wives may not partake of truma, because if a priest has relations with his wife after suffering his injury, he renders her a halalal, right? This is a woman who is disqualified from marrying a priest, as he is engaged in forbidden sexual relations with her. Just a little bit of the backstory here. If somebody has this condition, and as we're going to see in later Mishnahs tonight, this is only about when it was a voluntary act, when it was done by humans, not as an accident or as something that a person was born with. But in this case, where it was a deliberate act, such people under those circumstances are not allowed to use the Torah's term, enter the assembly. So that means that a woman is not allowed to get married to a person under such circumstances or to have intimacy with them. Thus, she becomes disqualified because she has been intimate with a person who is not able to be entered. Again, we're going to go into more detail about how these problems arise, but for the moment, understand that that is the underlying logic of why he is still allowed, the slaves are still allowed, but she is not allowed. Everybody got that so far? Maybe I'll just do the tagline at the end and then we'll come back.
Sorry, where are we?
We're on chapter 8, Mishnah 1.
Oh, okay, thank you.
If such a priest did not know his wife, meaning did not engage in sexual relations with her after the testicles were crushed or his penis was severed, she may partake of truma, as she had married the priest in a permitted manner. So the basic idea is that if they if the problem occurs, again, this is going to be a deliberate problem, not an accident, but if the problem occurs after they've already been married, then since their marriage was consummated while he was not suffering from this condition, therefore she is allowed to continue to eat from the truma based on that earlier relation. All right, questions or comments? And just a little bit of a warning, if you're uncomfortable right now, we're going to continue on this theme and other themes of a delicate nature for a few different Mishnayot. So just a little bit of warning. All right, so let's move on to Mishnah number 2, continuing this theme rather directly. And one who is deemed a man, and who is deemed a man with crushed testicles, what does that mean? It is anyone whose testicles have been wounded, even one of them, and one who has his penis one whose penis has been severed is anyone whose sexual member has been cut off. As for the measure that renders him unfit, if there remains a portion of the corona, even as much as a hairbreadth, he is still fit. However, if nothing is left of all the corona, he is considered as one with a severed penis, for whom it is permitted by Torah law to marry a Jewish woman. Okay. What in the world is going on? How could these things happen? Or like I said, we're going to talk about it, the difference between accident and deliberate, but you might be wondering to yourself, how could this ever be deliberate? Well, if you haven't already been informed, the ancient world, and in particular, in this case, the non-Jewish ancient world, it didn't always treat people very nicely. Sometimes these deeds would be done as a way of enslaving a person. Sometimes these deeds would be done voluntarily, and I wince even thinking about it. But in the ancient world, being one of the sarisim, being one of the eunuchs, was often a prestigious position. We see this very clearly in the story of Purim, where the sarisim, the eunuchs, play a very critical role in how the story unfolds. And indeed, we know from Persian history that many of the revolts and assassination plots were hatched among the eunuchs. People would deliberately do this to themselves or to their children as a means of social promotion, of trying to get one of these very important government positions. So it's hard for us in the modern world, thank God, to imagine this being done. But yes, this was something that was not as uncommon as it should be. But we'll come back to the commonness of this in a minute. A man with crushed testicles or with other wounds to his genitals and one whose penis has been severed are permitted to marry a female convert or an emancipated maidservant. And they are prohibited only from entering into the congregation and marrying a woman who was born Jewish, as it is stated, a man wounded with crushed testicles or a severed penis shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. So based off the strict reading of Deuteronomy 23, the congregation of the Lord means those in this context are those that were actually born into that status. However, they are able to marry others who are joining our status, whether it be through emancipation directly or through conversion. So they are still trying to find a modicum, a way that there can still be a relationship for this person. Questions or comments before we move on to Mishnah 3, which talks about more types of disqualifications.
I will have nightmares because of the topic.
It is not a happy topic, absolutely. And if you want to really have nightmares, look up the historical process of how eunuchs worked and what they did. It is absolutely abhorrent what people did to one another in the ancient world, and even what people were convinced to do to themselves. It is just absolutely staggering. And every day you should wake up that no matter what our problems are in the 21st century, be glad you live in the 21st century, and especially be glad if you are hearing my voice and watching this discussion from a free country.
Now, Rabbi, you say that some people did do themselves in order to promote socially.
Yes.
However, who guaranteed you that if you damage your testicle, they will accept you in the palace?
It's yes, it's like the ultimate college entrance exam of are you prepared to do this? As from what I understand, it depended upon the different culture and customs. Some places this was a price for admittance once you had actually been accepted. In others, this was something that was done as a way of increasing your chances of being accepted. But it depended upon the culture, and this was practiced in many parts of the world, not only the ancient Near East. All right.
Did we have eunuchs in Israel under the kings?
No. We don't see any example of eunuchs in the Jewish court. I've never seen any evidence of eunuchs being done in that time period within the Jewish system. If anyone has archaeology to the contrary, I wouldn't be 100% shocked, because we do know that the kings of Israel and Judah were often not the best ones for keeping what was actually Torah law, unfortunately. So if it did occur, it wouldn't be impossible, but I have not heard any records, and certainly what I've seen in the Tanakh does not lead me to believe that it was done. All right, so as long as we're talking about prohibitions of entering into the Jewish people, let's talk about the other most famous categories, which are the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Edomites.
Sorry, Rabbi, before moving on, because I'm not reading again the Mishnah that you finished now. So if someone cut themselves, cannot be keep being part of the Jewish people.
No, you don't remove yourself from the Jewish people, right? So you're not actually disenfranchised, if to use the citizenship term.
Okay. No.
But it does change the status for your wife with regards to truma. And if you were already like that, you can't get married to a woman. And if you were not Jewish, you would not be allowed to convert.
Oh, you can't.
No, if you were not
Yes,
Jewish and
of
did
course,
this,
because you don't have a Brit Milah.
well, among other things, but yes.
There's other reason why. I thought that there was the reason because you cannot make the Brit.
Because the Torah itself says in the passage from Devarim that somebody like this cannot be admitted into the assembly. So the Torah says it as a specific condition because, as you notice, it's not only the tip, it's also what's underneath that could be a problem. And you could still do Brit Milah even if what was underneath was in trouble. Trying to talk about this in gentle language. All right, so let's move on. We will unfortunately be coming back to this concept a little bit later on, but in a little bit less detail. So the Ammonites, the Moabites, these are two nations that when we left Egypt, came out and met us with war. And that, of course, has left a very bitter taste in our mouth. And it is said explicitly in the Torah, in Deuteronomy, also in 23, that they are not allowed to enter into the Jewish people. So now we're going to get some
But
detail.
Ruth,
Up. Hold on. So this is where we're going to see how they read that. The Ammonite and Moabite converts are prohibited from entering into the congregation and marrying a woman who was born Jewish. Right? So if you are a boy Ammonite or a boy Moabite, you cannot look forward to ever becoming Jewish. And the prohibition is eternal, meaning for every generation. We're going to come back to that in just a second. However, their female, meaning a Moabitess, a woman who is a Moabite or a female who is Ammonite, their counterparts, even the convert herself, meaning even a first generation, are permitted immediately. So the way that they understand this is that by reading the phrase for the Moabite and Ammonite as being a gender-specific plural, is telling us that the opposite, meaning the feminine women, the feminine converts, are allowed to enter. And indeed, as Natan mentioned, this is why Ruth, as a Moabite, was allowed to convert to marry Boaz and to eventually become the ancestor of King David. So there is a distinction between the men and the women based on the particulars of how the verse in Deuteronomy is worded. However, go ahead. Go ahead. Before I do, I'm going to do a big however, so go ahead.
Okay. So, however, I say no, however.
Go ahead.
I thought that my rationale is exactly the opposite. If I was allowing someone, maybe it was the man, not the woman, because the woman was the one that educated the kids, that the next generation passed through the mom, the Jewishness, and is the one that keep the home kosher. So having someone that is one of the two people that we had some issues and allow them, the woman, to be in charge of the next generation of the Jewish people could be more problematic.
Okay, so Natan, you are a wonderful Victorian European. The idea that women are responsible for the spiritual education of children is a relatively modern European idea. And it is mostly traceable to the idea of early industrialization and the early ideas of men going out and women staying home. But prior to that, everybody went out and everybody stayed home, as was necessary to be successful farmers and members of a community. And so the man would be at home as often as the woman, and the children would spend as much time with their father as they would with their mother. And so too, the responsibility for keeping the home kosher was shared by all people equally. However, what is more telling in this issue is that it's not about what our intuition would be. It's not about what our gut would tell me would be more or less likely. Even though we've already seen here in Mishnah Yevamot that the status of a child follows the mother, and you might therefore be concerned that the child would therefore be considered a Moabitess because of the mother, more so than if the father was. What is important is that that's not how the Torah wrote it. The Torah didn't say that was the way that we would read it. And so even if I feel a certain way, the Torah comes and says, nope, that's not the right way to read it. And we also know, of course, that once a person converts, it's immaterial where they came from. A Moabite woman who converts is considered to be equal as any other Jewish woman with regards to how she is trusted and how she is respected within the community. And certainly Ruth is the paradigm of that, who goes and behaves extremely carefully and is always very careful to follow not only Torah law with regards to the gleaning and the gathering of the peyot, the corners of the field, but to even go above and beyond when she is trying to explain the situation to Boaz in a way that will ensure the proper fulfillment of halakha. So we shouldn't feel that the women would be in any way, shape, or form less equipped to teach the offspring how to live a proper Jewish life, regardless of which nation they came from. Once they are Jewish, they are Jewish.
But that was rabbinical law, not Torah law. Torah law was no one, and the rabbinical say females yes, not males. That was a rabbinic interpretation, but the Torah neither.
Well, so the Torah, so this is where we get into a very good conversation of what counts as interpretation, what counts as innovation. The Torah spoke with a male plural noun. Now, the male plural noun could be all-inclusive. And indeed, in many cases, when we use a male plural in Hebrew, both biblically and especially modern, we are talking about men and women. It's a collective noun that is gender mixed, if you will. It's just the way the grammar in Hebrew works. However, the rabbis also recognize that there are some times where what is in the male plural could be only men. And they set themselves the task of trying to clarify, when does the plural mean everyone? When does the plural actually mean only the specific men? And this is a problem, dare I say, with Hebrew. Just like in English, there are many problems because, for example, we lack a plural second person. We don't have you and yous to mean a group, and sometimes that makes things confusing. So too, in Hebrew, sometimes the plural can be confusing of whether it meant everyone, men, women, everyone, or whether it meant only men. And the rabbis here believe that they are interpreting rather than innovating, that in this case, it must have meant only the men. And the proof, of course, would be the story of Ruth herself, that in the Bible, we have an example of a Moabite woman that is able to enter and become the ancestor of King David. So unless you are saying that King David's lineage is somehow against the Torah's laws, we have to accept that the interpretation was intended to only be excluding the men. But even there, here comes my big however. But even there, do we still say this prohibition is eternal? And the answer is yes and no. Meaning that an Ammonite and a Moabite is prohibited from entering into the congregation. That is absolutely still the rule. However, we have no idea who the Ammonites and Moabites are. That is to say, I don't care what DNA test you've done. I don't care what family tree you think you have. Jewish law considers all of the ancient people of the Near East to have been scrambled, mixed up, and interspersed during the great empires of the Assyrians and Babylonians. So the people who currently live in Ammon or Moab, which is mostly what would be modern day Jordan, are not considered to be Ammonites and Moabites. And the Ammonites and Moabites who used to live there, that were scattered around the rest of the Near East when the various empires moved the populations, we don't try to track them down in order to prohibit them from entering into the congregation. We are only responsible when there are clear categories of people that meet these categories, the definition. And since at least more than 2,000 years ago, because this conversation is in the Talmud, we no longer have a clear way of identifying these people. We follow the majority. And since the majority of the world is not an Ammonite and not a Moabite, therefore everyone in the world is allowed to become Jewish. And everyone, male or female, is allowed to convert. But like I said, that was settled a couple thousand years ago, as the dust was settling from the imperial shifts that happened, as it was a common practice in the ancient world to move populations as a way of preventing rebellion. So even though it says they are prohibited, even though that is the law on the books, this is not a law that is still enforced, nor can it ever be enforced. Egyptian and Edomite converts, right, they have a different status. Right? The Egyptians and Edomites, according to the Torah, they are allowed to enter into the congregation after 3 generations. So Egyptian and Edomite converts are prohibited from entering into the congregation only for 3 generations, both males and females. All right, so this is not eternal, but it means if somebody converts and becomes a Jewish person, and they're from the Egyptian stock of the ancient world or the Edomite stock of the ancient world, they would be allowed to convert, they'd be allowed to be Jewish, but they would not be allowed to marry a Jewish person. Now, you're probably going, wait a minute. If they're not allowed to marry a Jewish person, then who are they marrying? Well, just as we saw in the previous Mishnah, let me just scroll back up so that everyone can see what I'm talking about. Just as we saw in the previous Mishnah, that a person with the status regarding the genitals that we discussed can marry a convert or an emancipated maidservant, so too, the Edomite or the Egyptian convert could marry other converts or marry emancipated slaves. So there were people that they were allowed to marry, and after 3 generations, their status became normalized and permanently for them and their descendants.
But it's not the same logic for the Edomites than to the Ammonites and Moabites, because also they were mixed. Also, no one knows who are they originally.
Oh, yes.
So
No,
it's the same logic, so it's not eternal neither.
It's the same. It's the same logic. I'm sorry. The same logic regarding what?
That also that today it's not eternal that rule, that law that no one can marry them for the 3 generations, because still no one knows who are they.
Correct.
You can say more or less, but okay, but the other 3 no.
Right, and that is indeed the halakha l'maaseh, the modern law does not call modern Egyptians or modern Edomites as being bound by this. So if somebody came, from Cairo, this would not be an issue. But on the books in the ancient world, the rabbis have to discuss how the Torah was written and what the Torah meant during those early generations. However, there's a question here. Why do we prohibit males and females for 3 generations? Why not allow the women to be included immediately like we do for the Ammonite and the Moabite? Why? I mean, it's the same kind of language. And this is where an additional rabbinic interpretation becomes important. In the reason given for the prohibition of the Ammonite and the Moabite is the fact that the nations went out and met us in war. They came out and attacked us. Since, argue the rabbis, it is the nature of the ancient world that the men are the soldiers, therefore the prohibition must have been aimed at the men exclusively. This is one more justification, in addition to the existence of Ruth, of why this passage for the Ammonite and Moabite should be read as being male exclusive. However, the Egyptians and the Edomites, they are not singled out as having made war against us in the passage which details their prohibition for 3 generations. Therefore, it applies to men and women universally. Again, that tricky Hebrew plural could be only men, could be only women. The way that they find an additional layer of interpretation is by asking, does the Torah tell us why they're prohibited? And in this particular case, they give an explanation having to do with the explanation the Torah gives of the war that was fought by the Ammonites and the Moabites.
But it's counterintuitive, that explanation, Rabbi, because those two people that fight against us, the female, it's okay, they can marry. And the other two that they didn't fight, you cannot marry neither for 3 generations. So it's going against, it's completely counterintuitive, that explanation.
Welcome to Rabbi Shimon, right? Next passage.
Oh, okay.
Rabbi Shimon renders permitted the Egyptian and the Edomite females immediately, right? He says, why would you make the women of the nations that didn't make war against us have to wait longer than the women of the nations that did?
Correct.
Right? Rabbi Shimon said, the matter may be derived by way of an al fortiori, kal v'chomer, inference.
Mm-hmm.
If in a place where the Torah rendered prohibited the males with an eternal prohibition, the Ammonites and Moabites, it rendered permitted the females immediately. Then in a place where it rendered prohibited the males for only 3 generations, Egyptians and Edomites, is it not right that we should render permitted the females immediately, right? Why would you treat the women harsher in the second case when the overall prohibition is more lenient than it is in the first place?
And especially when the Egyptian woman helped us in Egypt.
Exactly right. Right. So there's lots of reasons to support his opinion. Rabbi Shimon's colleagues said to him, excuse me, let me roll that down. If you are reporting a halacha that you received from your teachers, we will accept it from you. But if you merely wish to prove your case with an a fortiori inference based on your own reasoning, there is a refutation to your argument. All right, so this is...
they were very snobs.
Well, so it's not a question of snobbishness. It's not a question of snobbery. The issue here is that halakha as a transmitted information is very, very important within the rabbinic mind. And in particular, the interpretation according to the 13 principles of interpretation, kal v'chomer being one of them, this a fortiori type of logic, is only binding if it is an actual received halakha that goes back for the generations. If it is your interpretation, if you are inventing this kal v'chomer, this a fortiori inference, that is not enough to be binding upon anyone else.
So we're talking to say, yes, that is something I received from one of the teachers. Well, they will go to check if it's true or not.
Well, I mean,
give up.
But that's you know, there is a basic system of trust built into the rabbinic system, right? That is the reason why we have smicha, why there is a rabbis make new rabbis who make new rabbis who make new rabbis. The idea was that you could count on a person who was a rabbi having had the proper training, that what they would share would be correct. And if it was not, the other people around them would correct them. Now, I should point out that ultimately Rabbi Shimon loses this argument, but he is going to claim that it is not his own inference, right? Rabbi Shimon said to them, that is not so, right? I disagree with your claim that an a fortiori inference can be refuted, but in any case, I am stating a halakha handed down to me by my teachers. So he argues with them on both points. He's saying it is halakha, and he is saying that even if it weren't, my kal v'chomer would be okay. However, in both cases, he is eventually disproven by Jewish law, right? If you invent a new, really, really good kal v'chomer, you really have a good, if this, then all the more so that does not mean it becomes binding upon every other Jew around the world as halakha. It could mean that for you, or if you're a rabbi for your community, that becomes the practice that is followed. But it does not mean it is part of the oral Torah, capital T, capital O, capital T. It just means it's part of your very compelling inference. And that's a very important element that the rabbis wanted to make sure that, given that there is no end to the creativity of logic, to the way that a person might use the tools to prove that black is white and up is down, they wanted to make sure that only those inferences that had already been established as halakha were kept as universal halachot. And that's why you don't see new midrashim of midrash halakha variety, where a new person will say, I have a new a fortiori, and therefore from now on, all of us are going to do X, Y, and Z. You can make an argument, it can convince people, but if they're not convinced, tough, you're out of luck. And even if they are convinced, that doesn't mean everyone else has to be convinced as well. And this is actually a very important stabilization or stabilizer for Judaism. Because even though people may act like logic is somehow this perfect and pure and never corruptible system of reasoning, that's simply not how logic works, especially in this case where we're talking about inductive rather than deductive logic. Maybe if you are talking about a strict Euclidean world and the geometry therein, you can use it to make certain logical proofs that everybody loved in their high school geometry class. But that does not mean that when you are trying to interpret the words of the Torah as they should apply to our lives, that you can simply say, but my statement is logical. Everybody must bow to my logic. That's not the way it works. You can try to persuade with your logic, but we are more than able to say, you know what? I'm not persuaded enough. And we're going to stick with our received interpretation as we have it. So it seems like a bit of a pointless argument, but in fact, this is a very important part of Jewish understanding of how law works. And then a new topic, but on the same theme, Mamzerim and Gibeonites who convert to Judaism in the days of Joshua. That is to say, the Gibeonites are the ones who converted, also known as the Natin, as we've talked before, are prohibited from entering into the congregation and marrying a woman who was born Jewish. Their prohibition is eternal for all generations, and it applies to both males and females. The Netanim, the Gibeonites, are no longer a valid category. Mamzerim are technically a valid category, but almost all communities have gone to great lengths to ensure that mamzerim are not created, and that we find ways to not establish mamzerim as an ongoing concern. There are some communities that are more obsessed with this category, and that is a bit of an issue, especially in Israel, where they control the marriage process. But that is a conversation for another class. All right, let's move on to Mishnah number 4. And we're getting back to the eunuchs. Okay, well, but not only the eunuchs, but also Yevamot. What happens with a eunuch and Yibum? What happens to the Levirate system when the brother that is left is a eunuch? So, Rabbi Yoshua said, I heard, meaning 2 rulings from my teachers. One ruling is that a eunuch performs chalitza with his yevamah, and his brothers perform chalitza with his wife. And the other ruling is that a eunuch does not perform chalitza with his yevamah, and his brothers do not perform chalitza with his wife. And I cannot explain these 2 rulings, meaning I do not remember the circumstances to which each ruling applies. So it seems, says Rabbi Yoshua, that there are some cases where the eunuch acts as though he was a regular brother in normal respects, although with the requirement of doing chalitza. And on the other hand, it seems there are some cases where the eunuch does not act in that circumstance and instead is a special situation. How does this work? Rabbi Akiva said, I will explain. a eunuch caused by man, right, which is literally called the eunuch or the saris adam, right, a man-made eunuch is what we're talking about. That is to say, one who became emasculated after birth, performs chalitza with his yevamah, and his brothers perform chalitza with his wife, because he had an hour of fitness. There was a time when he was not so rendered. There was a time when he wasn't a eunuch. On the other hand, a eunuch by natural causes, also called the saris chama, right, literally the sun, S-U-N eunuch, that is to say, somebody who was entirely lacking in sexual capacity from birth, does not perform chalitza with his yevamah, and his brothers do not perform chalitza with his wife, because he did not have an hour of fitness, meaning he never had the potential to father children. Or to use the literalness of the idiom of the sun eunuch, the sun never shone on him while he was still fit.
What's
Following?
happening, Rabbi, if it's literally an hour? Like the guy born, and literally 1 hour after that, they did the operation. Still is can marry it?
No. So when they say that this was 1 hour, they mean no amount of time. So they are literally talking about a time where he was born and he was fine, and then he wasn't. And they're talking about others who were born but never okay for this particular situation. However, the Talmud does go into more discussion, and they clarify that if a person is injured, if there is an accident, if there is some other tragedy, that even from illness, that can change the status to being like somebody who was born that way. So that they are really trying to focus here on more intentional unification. That doesn't sound like the right word. Intentional castration, to use a not quite exact English word. So this does not necessarily cover people in other circumstances, which might be more familiar to us in the modern world, where intentional castration is a very rare circumstance, at least in most countries.
So how long need to be in an hour in order to be allowed to marry?
How, mean in terms of if you were born?
Like, for example, like you say that he needs to be like a long time enough in order to qualify as someone that can son someone or something like that. What was the expression that you use? So how long is just 12 years, 13 years, 15 years? How long is the time that he was normal before he did himself in order to qualify as Ivana?
So I don't remember a clarification down to the hour or minute, but the general rule is, as the Mishnah here with the interpretation is explaining, meaning that if you were born unable, you were born in that status, then you are not treated as though you were ever married. And if you are born with that potential, but then removed it, then you are treated as though you could have been married. Sorry, my phone seems to be making more noise than usual. The reasoning goes back to the idea that the whole point of Yibum is about preventing the name from being blotted out. If the person could never have a name, meaning could never have children, then there's no reason to perform the ceremony. However, if they could have potentially had children, then even though now they can't, it is considered to be that they are treated as though they could have.
But still it's the same result. He can't have children because he cut himself. He
right.
did a surgery. So at the end, it's the same end.
Well, in the end, with regards to the actual having of children, it's the same. Yes. But with regards to his identity, the rabbis wanted to draw a distinction and believed the Torah was indicating that there should be a distinction, that the issue here was about the impossibility from birth. Now, as we're going to see, right, Rabbi Eliezer is going to enter in, to say that there is an opposite way to read this. So let's get his opinion, and then we'll go back to our final analysis. So Rabbi Eliezer says, no, rather the opposite is the case, meaning a eunuch by natural causes, the son eunuch, performs chalitza with his Yevamot, and his brothers perform a chalitza with his wife, because he can be cured. At least potentially, there is the possibility that a person born that way might have some way of changing that status. Whereas a eunuch caused by man, the Saris Adam, does not perform chalitza with his Yevamot, and his brothers do not perform chalitza with his wife, because he cannot be cured. Because it was done intentionally, we know that there is no hope for reversal. Rabbi Yoshua ben Betera testified about a man named Ben Megusat, who lived in Jerusalem and was a eunuch caused by man, that his brothers nevertheless entered into Levirate marriage with his wife in order to fulfill and confirm the statement of Rabbi Akiva. So it shows that there was an action that follows Rabbi Akiva's rules, and indeed Rabbi Akiva does win this particular argument. So let me give one more explanation of the logic differentiating between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Eliezer is saying, much like you are describing, that the current situation is what is more important. And if the current situation could be fixed, then we should treat him like a could-be husband. And if the current situation couldn't be fixed, then we should treat him like a never husband. However, the rabbis, the majority, which follows Rabbi Akiva, are saying it's not about the current status, which could be on and off like a light bulb, but instead it is about the nature of the illness, the nature of the infirmity that he is suffering. Its cause is more important than its current status, not because of the reversibility issue that Rabbi Eliezer is bringing up, but because there is a fundamental difference between one that had this done and one that suffered this from some other natural cause. And the identity doesn't flip, because how it was done is more important than what is its current physical status. The rabbis are not trying to pry into the internal workings, if you will. They are trying to create a category which is less flexible, which is more immutable, unchanging, based upon how it occurred in the first place. And that, in my opinion, is actually a more humane way to try and treat the situation and recognize the fundamental difference between one who chose this and one who was afflicted like this from birth through no fault and no problem of their own. But again, the logic could go either way. And that is why we don't simply leave it to logic, because ultimately the logic is not perfect on either side. There are counter arguments to all of this, and there is the potential to go to Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Akiva's opinion. And that's why ultimately we have the Masorah when it comes to the oral tradition. We have the actual chain of rulings that go through the Mishnah into the Talmud, and from there give us a foundation beyond which, yes, we are now left with logic, which is why the logic of not eating kitniyot makes perfect sense to some Ashkenazic authorities, and the logic of eating kitniyot during Pesach makes more sense to many Sephardic communities, because that is not something that was established through this generation of the Mishnah and the Talmud. So we are left with only logic, and only logic has been pretty good, but it also creates a lot more, shall we say, diversity as opposed to disharmony. Logic is a very fickle ally. It seems like it offers all the answers, and the logic, which is very convincing to us, is not always going to be convincing to the next person. And so ultimately, you vote. And that's how some of these were decided, where the opinions of some would be outvoted by others, where precedent would be brought that would establish which way the logic should be read. And that then becomes the precedent for us and all the generations in between. This is what makes Jewish law both a very flexible and living tradition. It's also what gives it its anchor, which has allowed it to remain a cohesive tradition despite thousands of years and many cultural differences of Jews around the world.
I think the advantage of the rabbis here in this discussion is that they tool for decisions are very clear cut. Because with Rabbi Eliezer, it's okay, when you need to be a doctor to see if he has a potential or not. In this case, it's much clean, okay, in that way. But also, I think that also the rabbis also decided in that way is because also Rabbi Akiva was more popular than Rabbi Eliezer.
Well, that's a little bit of a chicken and egg. Was Rabbi Akiva more popular and that's why they listened to him? Or did he become popular because he convinced them? And generally speaking, people found his reasoning and his teaching to be a very good teaching. So I'm not sure that this is just the case of the popular kid getting everyone behind him. I think he became popular because his teaching was so compelling. But just to come to your other point about the not wanting to reverse the decision and get the doctor involved and all of that, indeed, in general, the rabbis are very, very reluctant to ever have a fluctuating status of somebody. They don't want it to be today he counts as this and tomorrow he counts as that in a way that is not clearly defined and easy to track. They don't want that to be up in the air for anyone. That's why conversions are not reversed, marriages are not reversed, divorces are not reversed. When a status change happens, they really very much want the status to stay unless there is a very clear ceremony, for example, ending a marriage with a divorce that allows that status to change. But they don't want it to be 10 years later, oh, by the way, the divorce never happened. That's not the way the rabbis want it to be held. They want it to stay clear and cut and consistent. All right, and with that, we are not going to jump into Mishnah 5. We are going to save that for next week and have our discussion then. We are going to continue with eunuchs, just fair warning, but the topics hopefully you'll find relevant to other situations.
Very interesting, actually.
I think so too. I mean, even as uncomfortable, literally, as the topic is, it is still very interesting to see how it was handled and that. I think you'll find as well next week when we begin to talk not only about eunuchs, but also about androgynous and asexual people, that you might be surprised that the rabbis were considering some of the topics which seem to have only been considered by the population at large in the 21st century very recently. So take care, everyone. Chag Sameach. Have a wonderful Pesach.
Before you leave,
oh, yes, yes.
No, before you leave, because I'm receiving some text from some people, an email that want to be part of our Daf Yomi, and now we have an issue where to read and follow Daf Yomi for Psachim, no, for Shkalim.
Right. Yes. So
yes, please show me where, because I need to explain to the rest of the people.
So I'll send you some links that you can then share with the people who want to study that hopefully will help people tide them over.
Or maybe, Rabbi, you can publish them in the group, in the WhatsApp group.
Well, yes, but I think that some people maybe are not part of the group yet, and maybe you can get that information to them as well. But a reminder for the Talmud group, if you're also watching this, of course, with this week and next week being Pesach, we will not be meeting on Sunday for our Q&A. All right, everyone.
And it's only for Shkalim, correct? The lack of Sepharia.
You know, I haven't looked ahead, so I think so, but I haven't looked ahead, so I can't promise that.
Because they have something, but say Talmud Yerushalmi Shkalim. in Sepharia. So I started reading, and it looks like it's similar to the other, but I wasn't sure.
I'll send the resources that I can find.
Thank you, Rabbi, for the sure.
All right, everyone. Take care. Chag Sameach.
Thank you.